Welcome back. This week's podcast is going to be a very special interview with Professor Ted Chandler of Cuyamaca College, who is a veteran of the Vietnam War. Just a reminder, as always, I recommend that you keep your book with you handy so you can make reference to maps to get more out of the lesson. So let's go ahead and begin. First question is just a general one. How did you come to be in the Navy?
Well, I had two choices, either to go into the Navy as a naval officer or to go into the Army and become a grunt. And this was back in 1965, and I was just finishing up college, my last year of college, and I went home. I went to college in California, but I went home back to Massachusetts to see my draft board person, and when I went in to see that person, she was about 70 years old. She shook her finger at me and said, "I'm going to get you college boys." So I thought, well, I'd better do something quickly. So I applied to Officers Candidate School with the Navy, and I was fortunate to be selected. There were 111 of us that were taking a exam, and 11 were selected. So I felt pretty good that I was one of 11 selected for Officers Candidate School. And if I had not done that, then I would have been drafted into the Army. So
at that time there was a draft, and then there were exemptions for being a college student?
But it was only temporary.
But only temporary.
But only temporary. Once you got out of college, then you lost that draft deferment. And there was no question. I mean, I was physically fit. I wasn't thinking of getting married or anything like that. So
you tried to make the best of the situation.
Yes, I did.
And go into the Navy as an officer.
Yes. And so I went from there. From that point, I went through 4 months of Officers Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, and graduated in about March of 1966.
And how did you end up in naval aviation?
Well, that's a good point, because generally speaking, when you go through Officers Candidate School, you go into the fleet as a line officer, which I was a line officer when you graduate from Newport, and then all the aviation people go down to Pensacola and get there. You go through processes. So I felt as though that since I was at Newport, that I was going to go into the fleet and become a line officer aboard a ship, and that would be just fine with me, because we'd have nice facilities in terms of a nice clean rack and good food and all that. But that was not to be. I was assigned to a tactical air control squadron here in San Diego, and basically it comprised naval aviators other than myself, and I happened to become an intelligence officer. So what it amounts to is that we got shipped over to Vietnam in 1966, in the summer of 1966, and I spent a 13-month tour there at that time, and then I came back, and then we got shipped back over again. So I spent 2 combat tours in Vietnam, up in I Corps.
Okay, so that was my next question. How long were you there? And so it sounds like two separate tours. Mm-hmm. When you were there, okay, so the next question is, what kind of missions were you flying? You mentioned that you were a forward air controller, I believe.
That's correct.
Can you explain what that is, and then talk about the kind of missions that you were flying?
Mm-hmm. Well, basically, we, as forward air controllers, our responsibility was to control all the close air support in an area of operation. And we were with the Marines up in I Corps, which is the northernmost corps of Vietnam. There were 4 corps, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th are I Corps, and we had responsibility for everything in I Corps, which was just below the DMZ, separating North Vietnam from South Vietnam. And so in that capacity, every time that we had an amphibious landing, every time the Marines had an amphibious landing, then we were assigned to the landing forces, and we were responsible for controlling the close air support in conjunction with naval gunfire and Marine artillery. And so when we were assigned to the Marine Corps, we became part of what's called an Anglo team, which is Air Naval Gunfire and Marine Liaison Company. So
does that mean that you're flying and then you're in communication with Marines on the ground and artillery units and naval artillery, all
exactly,
connected?
Exactly, but it wasn't always a flying mission.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes we were on the ground and we were in radio contact. And any time that it was decided that we had targets that could be attacked with air resources like close air support, then that's when we were passed to the pilot in the aircraft, and we'd talk them into the target, and then so that's basically how it worked. And then if it was a target that was better taken out with naval gunfire, then my counterpart, who was a naval gunfire liaison officer, he'd take that, and so on and so forth.
So what kind of aircraft were these?
Well, when we
in the flying missions?
Yeah, in the flying missions, it was mostly F-4s, Phantoms, AD Spads. These are really old aircraft by today's terms.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the Spad was a propeller-driven aircraft left over from Korean days. Mm-hmm. And the A4s were jets, but they were basically designed for dropping bombs and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so we would either control the aircraft from the ground or from the air, and so it was depending upon the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. What about your training? Do you feel that you were well trained for these missions in advance, or was there a lot of learning as you go, or how did that work?
Well, most of it was on-the-job training for sure. Although I before I went over to Vietnam, I had about 3 months of various schools, so I felt as though I was well trained. Mm-hmm. And but there was a lot of on-the-job training for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the past, you've mentioned to me that you were in a crash. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about those circumstances?
Well, most of the time that we got around in helicopters, we were from one landing zone to another landing zone, and in that process, again, we're talking about up in I Corps, which was probably at this particular time was quite hot, you might say. And so
now, was that Viet Cong, communists, guerrillas, but also were there
the NVA,
there
right,
also were
right.
North Vietnamese regular forces.
In fact, we worked an area called the Qua Viet River, which is the southern boundary of the DMZ, and there were mostly Viet Cong in that area, but the NVA, in fact, for the first time, came over in 2 regiment sizes when I was there. So it was a combination of all of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But as far as the crash is concerned, I was in an H-34, and it's got its engine up forward, and all it took was a 50 cal round hit as we were coming into a landing zone. And so that crash, that's once. And another time we simply were over the water, going from a ship into Da Nang, and we ran out of fuel. Crashed the second time.
Some of those circumstances.
Yeah.
Now, did the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, did they have any way of knowing that the aircraft you were flying in were forward air control aircraft, and did they sort of seek you out in particular? Or?
Well, they wouldn't have known like that, but on the ground, I had a radio man with me, and so they were always looking for the forward air controllers or the naval gunfire spotters. So I mean that's a telltale indication, because he's got a radio pack on his back with a big antenna.
So the radio with the big antenna,
that's right. That's
really
a giveaway.
makes for a...
Right. Yeah, that's a giveaway.
Well, it must have been very frightening. I can't even imagine those circumstances. Now, how did you, after those incidents, when those crashes, how did you manage to resume going on missions after that? What does that involve?
Well, I mean, it's I wasn't too badly hurt, for one thing, but you just need it, and you're there for one reason and one reason only, and that's your fellow Americans, and that's your buddies, and you do whatever you have to do to get the mission done, to accomplish the job. Mm-hmm. So the motivation, whether you've had some problems or not, is always there, and you've got great people that you're working for, and you love them like a family, and you'll do anything for them, and that's the way you feel about it.
Okay, thank you. Well, the next couple of questions deal kind of with the topic of sort of daily life existence. And so the first of these questions is, how much time did you spend on ships and how much time did you spend on the ground, would you say? What was kind of the ratio there between the two?
Maybe about 20% on the ship and 80% on the ground, which is unusual. I know from, everybody thinks of the Navy as being...
Yeah, I think it's just one of those stereotypes. People think Navy, and then
exactly.
And then
but we
don't
actually
realize how many
but
are.
we actually were integrated when we deployed as a detachment. We were integrated within the Marine units. So oftentimes I was in a battalion level, Marine unit. So.
Did you ever have any involvement with what, I forget the nickname, was it the Brownwater Navy, those patrol boats and those kinds of things?
That was mostly down south in the Delta. Swift boats.
Swift boats.
Right. That was mostly down south, although they would have missions that went up to the lower part of North Vietnam, mostly on special ops missions. But the swift boat, the Brownwater Navy was in the Delta, where there are plenty of rivers and swamps and things like that.
Maybe you could describe a little bit of the kind of the routines. Sometime on ships, what's sort of like the daily routine like on a ship, going back and forth between missions and then being back on the ship? And then in terms, the second part of the question would be, on the ground, what kind of back and forth was there between being involved in missions and then so-called off time, or was there really any off time?
Yeah, there's a lot of off time. I mean, any of these situations are, it's like days and days and days of boredom, if you will, or, seeing no action, then all of a sudden there's a huge amount of action, frightening so. Mm-hmm. So there's day-to-day work that has to be done and all that, but beyond that, there's a lot of downtime, a lot of reading time, a lot of just passing time.
Now, when that off time moves to the more dangerous times of action and so on, is there warning that comes with that, or does it just happen suddenly, or what? How does that work?
Well, I was often involved with amphibious landings, so we'd have to do a lot of planning. We'd have to do a lot of briefing. We'd have to do a lot of coordination beforehand, because what we're talking about is a very complex military operation that involves boats going in over the beach, and then what we refer to as vertical envelopment, or with helicopters bringing troops behind the enemy lines. And so there was a lot of that kind of pre-planning going on. So you were pretty much geared up, and you knew when you were going to have action, and either you had opposition, or sometimes you didn't have any opposition. And then, of course, there are times, again, getting back to some of the other things that we did other than the amphibious landings, of which I was involved with 13 amphibious landings, again, all right up next to North Vietnam. That was the most dangerous zone at the time, in 66 for sure, 66, 67. And we would also patrol up and down the Qua Viet River, and I spent time in places like as I recall, Leatherneck Square was one, and Dong Ha was another area that I spent weeks there. I was in Khe Sanh. I was in a lot of different places that saw a lot of action from time to time.
Yeah, if I remember right, Khe Sanh, that there was one of the biggest battles of the war, was it?
Well,
Khe Sanh?
yeah. Khe Sanh, it was in 68. It was January of 68, where there were some 25,000 NVA outside of this fire base called Khe Sanh, and they had the high ground in terms of the mountains around there, and they made an effort to overrun it, and part of my responsibility at that time again was to coordinate air assets and stuff like that, which pretty much kept the base from being overrun oftentimes.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of the time, you said 1966 and 1967, well, you spent a lot of time there. That was, at that time, there was a tremendous number of American forces in Vietnam, and you were near the border with North Vietnam.
Right.
Now, as I understand it, the U.S. forces were more or less not allowed to move into North Vietnam. Is that?
No, that's absolutely true.
That's true.
Yeah, there would be no.
Was that a source of frustration for you and your colleagues?
Not at my level. I mean, I wouldn't say so. I guess I just didn't think about it.
Didn't think about it,
right?
But it was understood that this is
right,
that
exactly,
north of this place that,
or you couldn't go into Cambodia, as you remember at that time too.
Mm-hmm.
We're only talking about maybe about 90 miles between the ocean and the top of the DMZ where we were before you hit Cambodia and then come down.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was no hot pursuit even of going into Cambodia until I think Nixon.
Until later, right?
Until later when they decided to go ahead and stop going into Cambodia, which caused a whole other chapter.
Yeah, a whole other chapter. And some of that was kept secret for some
Right.
time too, as I understand.
Although I did, I was aware of and had been into a place called Lima site, which was a CIA site inside of Cambodia, which was rather interesting. That's another story.
Yeah, that is another story. Well, you mentioned that you were an intelligence officer,
Right,
So
right.
so there's the official theater of the war, and then there are
Right.
other things going on
Right.
as well. Is that a
Right.
safe way of putting it?
Exactly, but I was not in any clandestine. My job was to brief my fellow officers on the missions and so forth, and so that was my billet, as it's called, was a Naval Air Intelligence Officer.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, the next couple of questions are kind of broader questions about the war in general. And in this class, we're discussing the Vietnam War in the context of the Cold War in general. And my question is, what was your understanding of the purpose of the war at that time, and what was your view of the purpose of the war at that time?
Well, that's interesting, because I do look back on those, and try to refresh my mind exactly what my views were, and I'm not sure that I was more or less ambivalent to the politics or the reasons or anything like that. I mean, I was just looking out for myself, and I wasn't swept up with any siding with any one side or another. I mean, it was pretty much in '66. There wasn't a huge furor over the whole thing. It hadn't really. It was '68 when everybody, when the whole thing exploded. So my politics were negligible, I think you might say.
So you were an individual, and you would finish your college, and then you followed this course of becoming an officer
for one reason only, and that was to avoid the draft.
So it was to
avoid the
draft.
army. To avoid the draft, or to avoid becoming just a grunt in the army, which would have been what I would have had to have done. I mean,
do you think even with your college education at that time that the army would have
without a doubt, all they cared about was just getting the numbers. I mean, I would have had no advantage at all whether I had college education or not. All they wanted were the numbers.
What about in the course of your training to go over there? Was there any discussion about what the purpose of the war is?
That's interesting. I recall just watching a movie that about the Navy. You mentioned the groundwater Navy. There was a movie I remember that just a video, you might say, that just showed some boats, some swift boats in the Delta region, and that was about it. And there was no indoctrination as to or trying to discuss why we're going or not going. None of that occurred at all. There was no indoctrination one way or the other as to what we would be doing or not doing, because it wasn't actually. It wasn't a guarantee that I was on my way to Vietnam. I mean, I could have just as well had orders to Washington or to Europe or some other place. So the focus was not necessarily to indoctrinate you on whether the Vietnam situation was.
It sounds almost like there was a kind of inertia that this is just what's going to happen and what you're going to do. I mean, maybe that's not a good way of phrasing it. But
what do you mean by inertia?
Well, it's just like a series of circumstances, and and you just
go with
do what
it.
you have to do as an individual.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. And you fill out a request of what you'd like to do, but there's someone in Washington called the detailer that throws that out and says we need so many warm bodies here, so many warm bodies there, and
so in a sense, just this random official who's doing the detailing
right
determines a huge
yes
portion of one's life, because you
Yes,
could have just as
absolutely.
easily been sent to some other
I could have gotten
theater
yeah,
or to the
exactly.
Pentagon
I
or
could have got a
something like
plum
that.
job, and for the next 4 years, just had a wonderful whole time. but I'm not saying I didn't have a good time anyway. I mean, I did. I went back here in San Diego. It was nirvana. It was wonderful. If you know what I'm saying. Here I am, a young guy. The officers' clubs were great. Plenty of women around, and it was just a wonderful time back here. So,
Okay, well, thanks. Well, let's move on to some other questions. Now, we just asked the question about what the view on the purpose of the war was at that time. A lot of time's gone by, clearly. Have your views of the war changed over the years? And if so, how?
wow, they have changed 180 degrees. I mean, I can't tell you. I felt I got out of the Navy in 1970, and Vietnam continued on for 5 years, and it was absolutely a time when the country was up in arms, and there was so much waste of young people, and it was just. So I lived through that particular period of time, being fairly close to it. Even though I was out, I still.
Because you'd invested so much time.
Exactly. So looking back on that, I felt as though that the country was sold a bill of goods and we were lied to. The same thing that's going on now. But I look back on that time, and I must say that I was still a Republican and a conservative at that. But as time went on, I certainly have changed my views about whether we should have even been there or not been there, and I realized how much waste there was. And I think that's kind of led me in a whole nother direction.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that you felt you came to feel that you and the country in general had been lied to. For example, the Gulf of Tonkin incidents in 1964, that then President Johnson then went to Congress and asked for the subsequent resolution, which basically gave the president kind of an open-ended ability to escalate in Vietnam. Well, it's since been pretty well demonstrated that those incidents didn't really happen, or didn't happen the way that the country was told at the time. So that's one example. Can you think of other important examples where you felt that you as an individual or the country in general was just not told the truth about the war?
Well, for example, this whole idea of the domino theory, where unless we were in Vietnam and won, then the rest of Southeast Asia would have gone communist. That was obviously disproved, and there was a lot of lies that were told about the numbers of enemy that were killed, and that we were always on the verge of winning, and things like that. That even on a tactical level, I think we're definitely lied to. So there are many things that
When did
I
you
think
start
that-
to feel this way? When did it just kind of gradually, you would think about these things, and then, or how did that change come about?
It was a gradual journey, you might say, for sure, because when I first got out, actually it wasn't, when I first got out was 1970, and I was still somewhat insulated from the rest of, the academic upheaval that was going on, and
You're talking about the anti-war
exactly
movement and the
exactly.
campus protests,
Right,
which
right.
really didn't get going in a big way until really 68, and a lot of the big ones were really in the early 70s,
Right.
just when you were getting out.
Exactly, and I actually went over to Europe for a year after that, so I was, kind of avoiding any responsibilities that I might have had at that time, and a lot of it was just kind of to just have a good time and
Mm-hmm.
get away from what was going on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think again, my views changed in the next 5 or 6 years, and I recognized how much damage had been done, and so I not necessarily in a dramatic fashion. I mean, I wouldn't say that at that time it was a dramatic. And then I went on and went into the went into the workforce and worked for major corporations for the next 20, 30 years, and my own companies.
Okay, well, let's we're going to spend some more time on the whole post-war period in a little bit. Another question is about the people in South Vietnam. How much contact did you have with the Vietnamese themselves? Did you do a lot of work with the South Vietnamese military,
Yeah.
and what kind of contact?
Up in I Corps, there were very few civilians.
Because again, it was so close to North
So
Vietnam
close,
proper.
right? And all the villages were pretty much wiped out. I mean, it's just a no man's land, really. So no contact at all, really, with the civilians. We did have some ARVN South Vietnamese with us, but on a very limited basis. Most of that was in second and third corps and fourth corps.
So it sounds like that the war really had different fronts, and where you were in I Corps, it was less of, is it fair to say, less of a guerrilla war? And the further
Exactly.
south you had,
Yes.
headed, it was more of a guerrilla type.
Yeah, even the topology,
Struggle.
even the topology is very different. In the south of us, the jungles and in second and third corps, and then the delta was another whole area of rivers and swamps and so forth. In our area, it was not really jungly at all. Mountainous, yes, mountainous, and vegetation, but not not as heavy as the interior.
Okay. So it sounds like that experiences that one would have in Vietnam could really vary dramatically by where one was sent.
Yep, that's exactly right. Totally different experiences.
Okay, well, let's talk about the process of getting out of the service. You mentioned that you got out of the Navy in 1970. How did that work? Was there any kind of debriefing process or any kind of counseling, or just bureaucratically, how did that work? Did you just get papers one day and said that you're now out? Or?
Well, they wanted me to stay in for a third tour, and I said no way. So my obligation was up, and I received orders to leave, and I did. Mm-hmm. No counseling, no nothing, no.
Nothing like that. So you got your orders and you came back to San Diego?
Actually, I yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. actually, that's where I left from. My squadron had come back over, so I was detailed out in San Diego.
Okay, so then you were out, and you mentioned that you spent some time traveling in Europe, and then went to work in the private sector. And when over the years, especially in those early years in the 70s, when the topic of Vietnam came up, or if it did come up, what kind of reactions did you get, or what kind of questions did people ask you when they found out that you had spent so much time there? Or did it even come up?
Well, it did come up, but if I defended the military, and I still do today. I mean, if anybody brought up something that was negative, then I certainly would, take the time to defend my views, at that time. Answer that question again. Bear in mind, this is a long time ago, so
no, sure.
If I don't flow smoothly,
No, not at all. I was just wondering because, well, you hear stories about in the 1980s there was a lot of discussion. There was kind of a boom in Vietnam War literature and memoirs.
Oh, yes.
And there were these stories about veterans being spat upon and these kinds of things. And then there's been some research done on that, and they found that really didn't happen. At least that there were negative experiences, but the spitting incidents seem to have not really happened. So it led me to the question: well, what was it like when you came home? Because we're often presented with this picture of turmoil on college campuses, and I was just wondering, when you come back and you get out of the service, if those kinds of things happen.
I did not experience any of that at all. Mm-hmm. And it's rather interesting because now that we're talking about this, I met my wife. This is 36 years we've been married, but I met my wife. She was a Pan American stewardess, and this was in Los Angeles in about 1971, and she was a raging liberal from Berkeley. So we had some very spirited discussions, as you can imagine. I guess that's what I was thinking about when I said I defended my position. I mean, as far as she was concerned, I was just a baby killer. I mean, I'm kind of treating this fairly lightly. And so she had actually been in Berkeley during the Berkeley marches and participated in them. So the most unlikely of people kind of came together, and we still have spirited discussions. But I've come around much more to her way of thinking than my way. So maybe she had a significant influence on my. Getting back to your original question.
Yeah.
But
well, you'd mentioned before that your views changed over the years, and then you talked about how you have and you still do defend the military.
I love the military. I mean, I to this day, I mean, I still go to the Marine Officers Clubs and. And participate in a lot of things.
So, is it right then to assume that that when your political views changed, that you're really thinking about the political leadership of the country?
Oh, yes, exactly.
And
very good point to separate that. Except, this is my views right now. In fact, I mean. I feel as though that the Vietnam War and the politicians who ran the Vietnam War and the disaster that resulted from the Vietnam War totally broke our military, which it did. During the 70s and 80s, our military was broken the way we're on the verge of breaking it right now. And one thing that was important, as far as I was concerned, that there were some top leadership in the military, like Colin Powell, for example, who was entrusted with the building process, and he had, the Colin Powell doctrine of going to overwhelming force. I mean,
right. So now you're talking about Colin Powell, who himself served in Vietnam,
yes,
and rose through the ranks in the 70s and the 80s, and when we see a lot of kind of rebuilding of the Army in particular, what he was involved in. And
right.
then you're mentioning he was as I recall, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs
of Staff
during the first Gulf War.
Right.
And that's when, and the Colin and the Powell doctrine was one of, if you do attack or go to a war, then you do so with overwhelming
right.
force.
And you have an exit strategy, and what's the other one? And you have the people behind you totally.
So you make sure that the American public is
Absolutely.
informed and supports
Yes, absolutely.
the war, and there be an exit strategy. Right. All right. Well, this is leading us to the another question. So let's go ahead and ask it now, because we're already kind of gravitating towards this question about the lessons of Vietnam. Because ever since then, there's been this discussion of the lessons of Vietnam. What lessons are there to be learned? And you get different answers from different people about this. So what? And it sounds like, in a sense, that's what you were beginning to talk about.
Right. Well, I mean, just what we talked about. I mean, the lessons here are, you don't go into a war without the total country behind you. You have an exit strategy, and you go in with overwhelming force. All three of those tenets were invalid in our latest incursion into Iraq. Not so the first time, but certainly this time around they've been invalidated.
Mm-hmm. So you're speaking specifically now about the current war in Iraq, the invasion that began in 2003. And yeah, it's interesting because, in fact, it was just 4 years ago, either yesterday or 2 days ago,
right,
when we had the president landed on the carrier off the coast here and announced that the mission accomplished.
Right.
Which
and with 4 years, this has gone on longer than World War II. I mean, and we're so far behind the 8 ball right now. I'm not sure where we're going to go.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Yeah. Of course, in World War II, they did raise taxes instead of cutting taxes.
So if there are lessons learned from Vietnam, none of them were learned in this latest, or they were all forgotten. Let me put it this way: they were all forgotten in this latest debacle that we have going on.
Now, to be devil's advocate, people nowadays, when they talk about this conflict, they talk about this being a new kind of war, a war against terror, the global war on terror, and that the so-called lessons of Vietnam don't apply, and that's kind of old thinking, as maybe some critics would say. How would you respond to that position?
I think every lesson of Vietnam applies. But we're not following any of those.
Not following any of them.
I mean, that's without question. I think, other than, I mean, I see similarities. So many similarities between. I mean, just the propaganda that's put out by the government, for example, that was put out then, it's put out now.
Can you think of any specific example that strikes you as kind of parallel?
Well, again, I think that perhaps the propaganda is what, just the message that is coming out of our government today was very similar.
Mm-hmm. The notion
is very similar.
The notion that the light's at the end of the tunnel, that things
Absolutely.
are getting better,
right? Because
that we just have to stay the course and all those kinds
exactly,
of things.
Because Kissinger and Nixon knew 3 years before the war ended, back in 71 or 72, that the war was lost, but they continued on with a false hope, and that's what's happened here. And in the meantime, maybe 30 or 40,000 of our soldiers died during that period of time. So it's a matter of they do not want to be perceived as losing the war, so they will continue it at any cost.
So the political leaders know that the war, as they conceived it, is lost.
Exactly.
But they don't want to be perceived that way.
Yes.
And in order to have an acceptable political outcome,
right,
then the soldiers keep dying and being wounded.
That's
to
my
pay
point.
to pay the political price.
That's my point. They, as far as I'm concerned, they do not want to be perceived as being wrong. And that's exactly what's happened here. Again, getting back to Vietnam, we're talking about in 71, it's proven that we knew the war was lost, but we continued on. And 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, or even 3 years ago, I think that we knew that we're up against something that would eventually end in disaster, and was continuing on. Even with this latest surge and so forth, I feel as though that the president is just trying to run out his term and hand off this problem to the next person, because it's going to be chaotic over there, and he doesn't want it to be on his watch. So he'll just run it out, run the clock out. And that's similar to what Nixon did and Kissinger. And in fact, Kissinger is a part of the decision making today in what is going on, as you well know.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Kissinger, because his one of his chief aides in his company, Paul Bremer,
yes,
was
exactly.
the
viceroy,
the viceroy, or the proconsul, and was largely responsible for the de-Baathification program,
which is the biggest mistake of all,
and
the disbanding of the army.
Yes, in fact, since we are talking about that, there's a direct correlation between the beginning of de-Baathification, implementation, and disbanding of the army, and the beginning of the insurgency.
Right, there's a direct correlation. And so the same players, if you look at the main players that made the decisions, some of them have left the government, but they were all participants in Nixon's administration, and they're part of that whole thing. So it's just it's a redo of Vietnam. I mean, as far as the decision-making process is concerned.
So in terms of the parallels, we're not just talking about policies and mistakes that way. We're in some cases literally talking about the same people.
Yes,
in the government.
Exactly.
Interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, even though there's some 30 years that separates then and now, or longer, 35 years, same players.
Interesting. Well, going back to Vietnam, as you mentioned, the fighting and the killing went on despite the understanding that the war was going to be lost. And in 1975, South Vietnam did fall to the communists, Saigon, fell. Do you remember what your feelings were like when you found out about that and saw that on television? What kind of sense did that leave you with?
That it's over, and it's over. I mean,
So by then you'd already
right.
kind of accepted that it was coming to an end.
Right. I mean, when I came back from Europe in '71, I went to work for Lockheed Aircraft. I was an engineer in fact, the Ultra Living program. And so I lived up in Los Angeles, and then I got married the next year. So for about 3 years, I remember coming home every night and turning on the television, and just as it is today, there was nothing but the coverage of Vietnam, and that was absolutely terrible. And so after 3 years of this pounding of Vietnam and the blood and all that, just the chaos, and also recall that they had many of our pilots that were captured, the prisoners of war. That concerned me a lot because I had personal friends who were POWs at that time.
So you still had colleagues then who were, you were back and you had gone to work for Lockheed, and you still had comrades, colleagues who were in prisoner of war camps.
In fact, John McCain was a friend of mine, and so what I'm getting at is that part of the fall and the return of the POWs, that gave me tremendous relief. It was finally behind us. It was finally behind us. I do remember that. And to watch the POWs getting off the aircraft as they returned to the United States was a tremendous relief. I mean,
Well, it must have been.
Yeah. And so then it was behind us, and then for the next 30 years, there wasn't so much of a, there wasn't that intense. It's hard to, emotional. Situation going on. I guess that's the best way I could say it.
Well, interesting, Chris. It sounds like you felt, you really emphasized this sense of relief that it was over, that it was now
that we talk
it was
about
now behind us.
Yeah, no question. It was done, and again, for me, it wasn't so much watching the evacuation of the Saigon embassy and all that. That wasn't the point for me. It was when the POWs were coming off the aircraft.
Because you had a real personal connection with that, because those were men that you had worked with.
Yes, or at least one. I mean, but still, they're my former colleagues.
But before, in the years when the escalation was really building up, there was this assumption that there would be grave consequences if Vietnam went.
But that was all part of the propaganda. That's all part of the propaganda. That's all part of the domino theory that they were floating, that if South Vietnam went communist, then right after that it would be Cambodia and then Thailand and then India and then Australia and then Indonesia and on and on,
Interesting. Well, nowadays the Vietnam still has a communist government, but they have been engaging in these free market reforms and normalization with relations with the United States, and it seems that in the big picture now, relations with Vietnam are becoming rather positive. You hear of a lot of people now traveling to Vietnam.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I could take a tour back to where I used to. Up in Icor, I mean, there are tours there that you can go in today and feel perfectly safe. And not that I want to, it's not my interest, but you're right. And interestingly enough, I mentioned John McCain. He's the one that championed better relations with Vietnam.
That's right, and as I recall, he was instrumental in that because he had the political clout
Yes, he
to
did.
do that, because no one could accuse him of being
Absolutely.
soft on the communists, because of
Exactly.
course he had
Exactly.
spent so much time in the prison camps there.
And as you said today, I mean, there's a pretty good chance if you look at any of the electronics that you buy, parts of it could be made in Vietnam. I mean, they're very industrious, and they're right in there with the other Asian tigers when it comes to their economies.
Mm-hmm. So, is it fair to say that you don't really have any ill will towards the Vietnamese government, or is that overstating it? Or
no, I have no ill will at all. I really don't. And even on a personal basis, I don't. I mean, there are a lot of Vietnamese that came over here after, or during and after, and I've never felt any antipathy toward them as a people, or for that matter, the government. I believe I fault my government more than I fault their government, even at the time. Now that I look back, I mean, I understand and I know history and what took place there. For example, during World War II, and then the French, and so on and so forth. And you have to admire them, really, when you get down to it. I mean, they took us on and beat us.
Mm-hmm. So for them, it was maybe, I mean, we associated, and we still associate the war with the battle against Vietnamese communism, supported by international communism. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like you're saying there's also this strong kind of nationalist component to the war, where they're desiring independence from French colonialism and Japanese occupation during World War II.
Absolutely. I mean, and we were occupiers. I mean, we became occupiers. We ostensibly, went in there to stop South Vietnam from falling to the communists, but basically with 500,000 troops, like we had in 68, 69, we were occupiers, and they, how would we feel if we had 500,000 troops here? And that's the problem we have in Iraq today too. I mean, we're basically occupiers. There's not the war is over. It's so stated by Bush, and now it's an occupation.
Okay, so you were saying that from the Vietnamese perspective, it was a kind of occupation, and you think that played a big role in kind of provoking and strengthening
without a doubt. Right, without a doubt. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong were supported, of course, by China and Russia. I don't want to say that it was all the nationalistic effort, because they received all their SAMs, their missiles, all their equipment and everything from either China or Russia, and in fact there were Russian pilots who were flying their MiGs oftentimes.
So there was direct Russian involvement?
Oh, definitely there was.
Now I've heard that also, so this takes us back to the theme of the Cold War, because from their perspective, or at least the allies of the communists in Vietnam, they also saw it as a part of the struggle of the Cold War. So we see them putting resources in too.
Yes.
Advisors,
yeah.
The surface-to-air missiles, as you mentioned.
Right.
I've heard stories before too that a lot of the small arms came from communist Eastern European states. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true, because, for example, Czechoslovakia were known for their armament industry, and they made great weapons, So sure, all of the Soviet bloc was involved. So there was, this titanic struggle, you might say, from that standpoint that went on, where was the force, the Allied forces against the Communist forces for the.
Obviously, it's an impossible question, but it makes one wonder what would have happened in Vietnam had there been neither U.S. involvement nor external communist involvement. What course things would have gone, but like I said, we can't know that.
Well, I think we can. I think the same result would have happened. Recall Ho Chi Minh was the North Vietnam was separated into North Vietnam and South Vietnam by the French, and by the treaties that occurred, back in, after the Second World War, and so Ho Chi Minh was a dedicated communist, and he wanted to make all of Vietnam communist, which is the result that we got, whether we were there or not. The result is there.
Interesting. Well, I sure want to thank you for your time. Are there any? Is there any last idea or anything that comes to mind in particular that you want to share? We covered a lot of ground.
Right. I think as we're talking here, the similarities of Vietnam and of Iraq today are huge. I mean, that's been brought out in our discussion here. I mean, I think about it, but until you really verbalize it and think about it more, and hopefully we'll learn our lesson. If we don't, to our peril. And so that's basically it.
Well, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for your service both in Vietnam, and thanks for your service as a great teacher and colleague here at Cuban College, too.
Thank you, Pete.
And maybe we'll have to do it again sometime.
Okay.
But we'll sign off for now. Thanks a lot.